So if anybody, like, I mean, we could start with anybody who wants to jump in and talk a little bit about, their thoughts on the charges against Julian Assange under the Espionage Act. That would be great, and maybe clear it up for people that don't even understand how that's being used against a journalist.
I'm happy to start us off there. I mean, the long story short here is that we are many years into a bipartisan crackdown on the public's right to know. And the efforts across administrations led by presidents from each of the major political parties have dramatically restricted press freedom. And I want to locate this not just under Biden, but even going back 2 administrations ago to the last time a Democrat was in the White House. That was unfortunately the high, or more accurately, low watermark in terms of an administration prosecuting journalists as if they were spies for releasing into the public information that we all have a right to know. The reason Julian Assange is a household name is because he exposed US military war crimes and a cover-up that no one has ever been held accountable for. And the idea that we are now, the United States of America, is prosecuting publishers for exposing war crimes to the public is a grave inversion of the, not just principles in the First Amendment, but the very basis for American exceptionalism. You'll hear any number of political figures from the center to the right wing claiming that America can do no wrong. We are doing very wrong here, because we not only assassinated some journalists in Iraq and then covered it up, and now we're trying to criminalize the effort of exposing that information to the American public. And this really goes to the heart of whether we live in a democracy or instead merely a country that claims the word while routinely violating the principles. And I would say that's not just a First Amendment interest. This is a government legitimacy question that we are striking at. I'm happy to get more into that as we go, but eager to hear other people's thoughts as well.
Yeah. And I mean, please jump in if you I think that too. I think it totally changes the narrative of whether or not we're a democracy in this country, because if we don't have a First Amendment, really, are we?
Yeah, that's really a key point. I mean, really what we've experienced in this last decade is, you could say, a twin attack on whistleblowers and on journalists, and they're very much tied in. And we've seen through the George W. Bush and Obama administrations the escalation of that attack. Obama set a doleful, terrible record of prosecuting more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, which is now more than 100 years old, than all the other presidents combined. 9 whistleblowers were indicted, prosecuted, harassed by the Obama administration. And the administration hesitated then to go after legally. I mean, there were other efforts, but to legally indict and prosecute a journalist, a publisher, that was considered a bridge too far in the person of Julian Assange. What's happened now is a further escalation, not only going after whistleblowers, but also after a publisher, after a journalist named Julian Assange. And there's sometimes a confusion, and the mass media participates and accentuates this, that supposedly Julian Assange is a whistleblower. He's not. He's a journalist. And to prosecute him is to prosecute the same kind of entity in terms of journalistic and First Amendment function as the New York Times or the Washington Post. We know that's not going to happen because they're amplifying the outlooks of the warfare state instead of challenging it. So what Julian Assange has done, what WikiLeaks have done over the last decade, is to really utilize the principles of the First Amendment so we can have the informed consent of the governed. If you don't have informed consent, if you have uninformed consent, you don't have democracy.
Yeah.
This is the first time that a journalist has been indicted under the Espionage Act for publishing truthful information. Journalists are allowed to publish material illegally obtained by a third person if it is a matter of public concern, and the U.S. government has never prosecuted a journalist or a newspaper for publishing classified information. The indictment charges that Assange and WikiLeaks obtained and published classified material that Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning had provided to them, And many of the charges allege that Assange had reason to believe that the information would be used to damage the interests of the US or used to the advantage of a foreign nation. But as Shahid said, the material that WikiLeaks published was evidence of war crimes. And if I could just take a minute, we lose something in this whole conversation, and that is, what did WikiLeaks really publish? What is so threatening to the US government? 400,000 field reports about the Iraq War, 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians, and evidence of the systematic murder, torture, and rape of the Iraqi army and authorities that was ignored by US forces. 90,000 reports about the war in Afghanistan, including the Afghan war logs that recorded more civilian casualties by coalition forces than the US military had led on. And the Guantanamo files, 779 secret reports about the US government's torture and abuse of 800 men and boys at Guantanamo in violation of the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture. But the most notorious release by WikiLeaks was the 2007 collateral murder video, where a US Army Apache helicopter gunship targeted and fired on unarmed civilians in Baghdad. At least 18 civilians were killed, including 2 Reuters journalists and a man who came to rescue the wounded, and 2 children were wounded. An army tank then drove over one of the bodies, cutting it in half, and that constitutes 3 separate war crimes under the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah, I don't think people understand that, because they turn it's perceived in a way. And I see this happening where they hang it out like, oh, but that's exposing stuff that's a matter of national security, or that'll damage, like they draw this distinction between what the public is useful for the public to know and what is protecting national security. And these are things that I think really have nothing to do with national security. And they just use that to scare people that this is not something we should know.
Yeah, the First Amendment doesn't say that it applies only if the U.S. government thinks that nobody is damaging so-called national security. And the reality is that there are constant leaks of classified information out of Washington to major media outlets. They're leaked out, as former Senator Moynihan has said. If they didn't leak out, if that process didn't happen, the U.S. government wouldn't basically be functioning the way it functions, because virtually every day you can look at mainstream media, there's classified information being put out because it is leaked by government officials who have their own motives. Usually it makes certain people in the government or policies in the government look good to selectively leak out. So what we have on the contrary here, the flip side is, we have a selective prosecution because it's information that, rather than puffing up or making the US government look good in a lot of eyes, it actually exposes the criminal nature of US foreign policy, and now what is a 20-year continuous warfare state in terms of targeting many different countries. I think that people often get confused, and not only the US media, but unfortunately even outlets like The Guardian in Britain, they sort of make it a litmus test. Do you like this guy? There are things about him that you won't like about him, as though that somehow cancels the First Amendment. It's not an amendment that says if you like what somebody publishes or reports, then they're protected. And if you don't like what they report, or you don't like that they report, then the amendment, the protection of the First Amendment disappears. That's a completely authoritarian, if not totalitarian, view of what the First Amendment would be.
You know, if publication of so-called national security secrets violated the Espionage Act, we wouldn't know about U.S. government misconduct during the so-called War on Terror. The Washington Post's expose of the CIA black sites, the torture and abuse of prisoners in Afghanistan and Iraq that the New Yorker and 60 Minutes 2 disclosed, and the warrantless surveillance program revealed by the New York Times. Noam Chomsky said that the government always invokes national security when it doesn't want the people to know what they're doing in their name. And national security really means the security of the state against its own citizens.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.